There was no wall nor occupied territories when Mark Twain and the New Pilgrims journeyed from Nazareth to Jenin. No West Bank, no settlements, no checkpoints, no occupation. They stayed here in this Greek Orthodox churchyard just outside Jenin. Like all good Greek Orthodox churches in the Holy Land, this one is locked closed. It is also clearly unused. No sign of bomb damage, no sign of a plague, no sign of ethnic cleansing, just no sign of life. Curious, but only quite so. Like the excursionists, on we press. This rather sad sight, and that could either be me or these Roman ruins, used to be the rather splendid, apparently, Roman city of Samaria, capital of this area, and it was from here that the Good Samaritan left to become part of Christian folklore. Now, as you can see, the place is falling to pieces completely, and since the Israelis left in the mid-90s after the Oslo Accords, the place has just gone to pieces with graffiti everywhere, and you can actually see a reverse of archaeology happening, whereby the land slowly is rising and reclaiming some of the low-lying ruins. And on they did press, by now in a hurry to reach the mother lode of Jerusalem. On their way they stopped at this village of Al-Luban, recently in the news after Israeli settler militia tried to burn down the mosque in retaliation for the villagers trying to reclaim their own land. This is the old mayor's house. The villagers believe Mark Twain would have stayed. Rubble and rubbish are as much a West Bank motive as Israeli checkpoints and settlements. When they eventually arrived at Luban after 18 hours in the saddle, they were exhausted, and somehow the caravanserai had managed to get split up, so they had to sleep outside as best they could, rather than in the usual tents. Mark Twain noted that we could have slept in one of the larger houses in the village, but there were drawbacks. The houses were populous with vermin. There was dirt on the floor. There was no obvious conveniences. There would be a family of goats in one room and donkeys in the parlour. And they couldn't sleep anyway because outside the dusky, ragged, earnest-eyed children and villagers would spend all evening on their haunches pointing at them, discussing them and criticising them in their noisy tongues. Of the next morning, Mark Twain wrote, "About daylight we passed Shiloh, where the Ark of the Covenant rested 300 years, and at whose gates good old Eli fell down and brake his neck, when the messenger, riding hard from the battle, told him of the defeat of his people, the death of his sons, and more than that, the capture of Israel's pride, her hope, her refuge. The ancient Ark, her forefathers brought them out of Egypt. It is little wonder under these circumstances that he fell down and brake his neck. But Shiloh has no charms for us." Meanwhile, the biblical connotations at Shiloh have brought Old Testament enthusiasts here from around the world, albeit mostly in this case from Brooklyn. For these people, there is ample biblical justification for not just establishing themselves here illegally, but driving rival religionists out. The settlers can look out from the hilltop and see other settlements on every other hilltop. In spite of constant protection from the Israeli army, they just daren't go into any of the valleys in between. It's a horrid life for horrid people. Well, it's a shame to disappoint the good diggers of Brooklyn looking for their lost ark, but me fears they may be in for a long dig. The Ethiopian Jewish tradition has it that one of Solomon's sons and the Queen of Sheba brought it there. The book of Revelation suggests it is in the temple of God in heaven, albeit in a vision. What we now call South Africa and Zimbabwe claim they have the ark, as indeed do the Yemenis and the Irish. The Knights Templar swear they took it to Languedoc in France. And a stately home in Warwickshire in England is also thought to be a possibility. Of course it's a myth, and nothing wrong with that. It's only recently that the word myth has come to mean something that is untrue. For thousands of years before then, people used myths to explain the inexplicable. The Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Tibetans, the Mayans all had their ark myth and motive, and they used it to convey the emotions of divinity. They'd all be amazed to think that people today are taking these myths in a literal sense. A day later, Mark Twain and the new pilgrims found themselves not just in Bethlehem, but in the very place where, as he put it, the first Merry Christmas was uttered in all the world, and from whence the friend of my childhood, Santa Claus, departed on his first journey. He added that, needless to say, the manger was tricked out in the usual tasteless style observable in all the holy places of Palestine. The Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem is shared by the Greek Orthodox, Armenian Orthodox, and Roman Catholic sects. But as Mark Twain noted, the priests of the Orthodox and Latin churches cannot kneel in the sacred birthplace of the Redeemer, lest they quarrel and fight on this holiest ground on earth. This is an Armenian Orthodox service in the manger. The three sects must have no contact with each other at prayer and have a strict rota system for masses in the manger chapel. Mark Twain would have loved the absurdity of the religious decontamination process here. After each mass, the priests from the two sects, not just in prayer in the manger, have to sweep and fluffy dust all around the chapel in preparation for whichever sect's turn is next. Here we see the Greek Orthodox and Roman Catholic clerics sweeping away all traces of Armenian Orthodox pollution, so when it's time for their mass in the manger, there's no sign of an infidel faith having gone before. It's all very well, but the house husband in me couldn't help noticing it was all brooms and no pans. There's really not much for the imagination to see at Jericho, or as Mark Twain put it, ancient Jericho is not very picturesque as a ruin. He recounted the biblical story of how for 6 days Joshua's priests marched their Ark of the Covenant around the city walls and blew their trumpets. Then on the 7th the walls fell down, and they had fun massacring all the men and women, young and old, yea, even the oxen, sheep and asses inside. Unfortunately, on this occasion we have to let facts stand in the way of a good story, and say that since Mark Twain's time, archaeologists have shown that the city was destroyed by fire several hundred years before Joshua's visit, and was already abandoned by the time of his trumpet voluntary. As Mark Twain left Jericho, he huffily declared, "No second advent. Christ has been here once and will never come again." This is the Dead Sea, the spot where Mark Twain and the new pilgrims had what he described as a funny bath. He wrote the place had a scorching, arid, repulsive solitude and gave off something of an unpleasant smell. A silence broods over the scene that is depressing to the spirits. It makes one think of funerals and death. Well, today it's different, but no better. The swimmer can still float, but the other swimmers are now mud-bathing Russians from the nearby settlements, and the wild shores of the Dead Sea have been commercialized, quite illegally, by them too, and the visitor is forced into a sort of hideous resort experience, complete with blaring music, whistling watchtowers, and Israeli guards. Like Mark Twain, the visitor today is likely to take one float and hot-foot it back up the lunar landscape above sea level to Jerusalem, where we'll meet again in the final episode.